Hi, this is John Farrell from Gaming Trend with Danielle Lauzon, the designer of the upcoming Gloomhaven tabletop RPG.
Hi.
And I know that this is influenced in a lot of ways from the board game. Was the idea to start with to make it something that was connected and had some mechanical similarity, or was that something you came across as you were developing the concept for it?
That's really a great question that let me preface this with, I just joined the Gloomhaven team probably back in August. So this got announced last year at PAX. So let me tell you how long this has been in production before I ever showed up. But what I can tell you of what I know of it in the production and the idea is we're going to take this board game that's already really narrative, already has some really interesting mechanics, already has a combat system that's pretty tight, and we're going to make it into an RPG where people can run their own stories and tell their own jazz about the Gloomhaven world.
And it's interesting from the perspective of a designer. In some ways it's helpful because you're given some lore to work with, you're given some mechanics, but it's also kind of a constraint that you have to find out how to use them in a very different context.
Yeah, it's very interesting because the elements of the board game lend themselves really well to role playing. But you're right, there are some constraints, we want some familiarity between the board game and the RPG. We want them to be gateways into each other. So if people play the RPG and go, I've never heard of the Gloomhaven board game before because I've been living under a rock for 5 years, then, there's a board game I can play too. Oh, does it work the same way? Oh, yeah, okay, but I don't have a full character sheet. I have this instead. Oh, okay. But it works similarly. Oh, okay, there's a lot of familiarity. So we want that kind of cross-reference, which means we do have that constraint of you're flipping cards to do things, and you're using cards to do things. But then also as a tabletop RPG, you've got cards instead of dice, and people don't own cards. Not those cards in specific, because those cards are proprietary to this system. So yeah, there's component elements and things like that become a constraint.
And for people who don't know, some of the things that are shared between the board game and the tabletop are, for one, the base mechanic, where you're pulling cards off the top of the deck, which have modifiers that are going to be affected by your stats.
Yes.
You reshuffle on a critical failure or hit.
Yep.
Right. It also has secret agendas that, if you complete, will help advance your character.
Yes, to a certain degree, yeah. You have a faction that you join in-game, and they are interested in what you're doing as a mercenary, and they give you some extra kind of secret goals, and they don't have to be secret to the table if you don't want them to be, but they're kind of secret to your character. And then if you do them, you advance within the society that you're doing things for, and that gives you some bonuses. But it's not the same way that you're gaining perk points in the board game to get special little perks.
It's faction specific.
Yeah, it's faction
specific. What is the thought on if multiple players are in the same faction? Do they have similar goals?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that, in fact, it would be very interesting if, an entire group was all the same faction. How would that work out? Is everybody working toward the same goal? Maybe they all have different contacts within the faction, and their different contacts want different things. And that's all kind of stuff that we'll cover in the RPG, of being able to say hey, if you've got two people who are part of the same faction, here's how to give them their own personal thing, or things that will support each other. You're gonna, we want these books from this library that you're breaking into. And we also want this other thing. And, if you get both those things done, we'll pay you, but now both of you have to work together to get both those things done, kind of thing.
And it's a neat idea because mostly faction level play is not something that really has a mechanical effect or affects people's goals, except in a very vague sense.
Yeah.
And Gloomhaven had different ways to interact with things like donating to a church to level it up and developing the setting that way.
Right.
You're giving people more direct tools to be able to do that in the RPG.
Right. Yeah.
And I should note, if people want to know more of this information, I mentioned the design diaries at the beginning of this, but do those come out on the 1st of every month, or is it?
It's the 30th of every month. which I guess in February will be the 28th. But it was the closest day that was like the last day of every month, except for February has a 30th.
I'm interested to track that because most of RPG development is something that is very behind closed doors. I don't really know what the timeline on it usually is or the steps you have to go through to process it.
Oh man, I mean, I've been doing book development for a very long time, and I can tell you that it pretty much takes like 6 months to write a book.
And it's very different from writing a book where you're just trying to get cohesive beginning, middle, and end. You've got to deal with artists. You've got to deal with layout, making the rules clear, text makes sense, getting an index in the back, which is its own entirely different process.
Yes, there's a whole person whose job is to index things. People who excel at that. That person's not me.
So do you have, I know that things are not exactly set in stone at the moment, an idea of when people should be looking out for this or expecting for it to be something they could play?
So my hopeful goal, cross my fingers, is that we can get everything ready to get to a publisher by June.
Okay.
And then the publishing gods and the shipping gods hopefully get it out by the end of summer.
They've been very angry lately.
Yeah, they sure have been. Anywhere between 2 and 6 months. But yeah, that is my goal, is like by June, we should be happily in a good place to, everything's been play tested and we're in a really solid place with the mechanics. We're ready to ship this thing off. Anything could happen between now and then. Cats could catch on fire. The world could fall down on us. There could be another pandemic. Lord knows, anything could happen.
And it probably will.
Yeah, of course.
Well, great. I'm really excited for it because you're right. The basic engine for it works really well. You're not able to count cards because of the way things will be cycling. It means you have a pretty good idea of what the range of possible versus impossible on your character is. Is there anything you want to make sure people are keeping an eye out for that's coming up, or anywhere else they can follow you to hear from you directly?
Well, I mean, I'm doing my monthly updates, and I'm going to do a lot of behind the scenes rules stuff. But once we start getting some finalized text in, I'm going to start sharing a little more often some of the finalized setting text and things like that. So as we get closer to the final product, we'll be able to kind of tease a lot more of the setting and everything you'll be able to see in the RPG.
It's an interesting element because the board game has a lot of setting elements, but didn't really flesh them out the way you probably are about.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting because it's like, here's 5 different elements of the board game that are a sentence each. Now turn this into 1,000 words, please.
And that's got to be difficult because there's oversight on all of it. So you want to be creative, but you want to be beholden to the board game.
Yeah, I mean, I trusted my writers. We have a lot of writers who are excellent, creatives, to come up with some things within the themes of Gloomhaven, and but also really interesting and new stuff that if you're a fan of the board game and its setting, that you'll feel really like more connected to the world and what's going on.
Well, thanks a lot. I'm excited to see more of this.
Yeah.
I hope all of you are too. And you're going to be able to keep track of this again. All the places you mentioned, we're going to be covering more of it. Until then, be ready.